After 2 years of absolute silence, I received a thick envelope from my estranged daughter. I was so delighted my hands shook, and I wanted to tear it open right there in the kitchen. But my wife grabbed my wrist and said, "Wait." I asked her what was wrong. She pointed at the back of the prepaid envelope and said, "George, can't you see it?" I put on my reading glasses, looked closer, and what I saw shattered my heart into 1,000 pieces. It wasn't an olive branch. It was a trap to steal everything we owned. Before I tell you the rest of this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to protect yourself from the very people you raised. My name is George Bennett. I am 71 years old, and for the last 40 years, my life was defined by the quiet hum of hard work and the simple goal of providing for my family. I spent decades as a logistics manager, working long shifts, analyzing supply chains, and saving every extra dollar so my wife Diane and our daughter Alyssa would never know the sting of financial panic. I never needed luxury. A paid-off mortgage, a reliable car, and a peaceful retirement in our suburban home in Ohio were all the trophies I ever wanted. But peace is a fragile thing, especially when the people you love decide your sacrifices are just a down payment on their entitlement. It was a crisp Tuesday morning in October when the illusion of my family finally cracked. I was walking down our long asphalt driveway to check the mail wrapped in an old cardigan, enjoying the quiet chill in the air. The neighborhood was silent, save for the rustling of dry leaves. I opened the metal mailbox and pulled out a stack of utility bills, a few supermarket flyers, and right in the middle, a thick, cream-colored envelope. The handwriting on the front hit me like a physical blow. The loops of the letters, the slight slant of the ink. It was Alyssa. My heart began to pound against my ribs in a frantic, irregular rhythm. It had been exactly 2 years since I last spoke to my only daughter. 2 years of agonizing silence, unanswered voicemails, and skipped holidays. The rift between us hadn't started with a screaming match. It started with a firm but necessary no. 2 years ago, her husband Craig had come to me asking for a $75,000 loan for his 4th startup venture. His first 3 businesses had failed spectacularly, leaving a trail of unpaid contractors and maxed-out credit cards. When I refused to fund another sinking ship trying to protect the retirement Diane and I had worked our whole lives to build, Craig stormed out of our house. Alyssa followed him, throwing one last look of absolute disgust over her shoulder. She told me I was selfish. She told me I was dead to her. For 24 months, I carried that rejection like a stone in my chest. I spent countless nights staring at the ceiling, wondering if I had made the right choice, wondering if securing my family's financial future was worth losing my daughter. And now, holding this envelope, all that pain seemed to evaporate. A rush of overwhelming paternal hope flooded my veins. She was reaching out. She was breaking the silence. She wanted her father back. I practically ran up the driveway, my knees aching in protest, but I didn't care. I burst through the front door, the hinges rattling. Diane was in the kitchen pouring herself a cup of decaf coffee. She looked up, startled by my sudden entrance. Diane is 69 years old, a retired school teacher with a sharp mind and an intuition that has saved me more times than I can count. When she saw the tears welling in my eyes, she set her mug down immediately. I held up the envelope, my hand trembling so badly the paper shook. "It's from Alyssa," I said, my voice cracking. "She finally wrote to us." Diane's face softened, and I saw the same desperate hope reflecting in her eyes. The ache of a mother missing her child is a profound, silent agony, and Diane had borne it with a quiet grace. I grabbed a butter knife from the counter, ready to tear into the thick paper, eager to read whatever apologies or news she had sent. But just as the metal touched the paper, Diane's gaze shifted to the back of the envelope. Her posture stiffened. "Wait," she said, her voice dropping an octave. "Wait, George. Let me see that." I stopped, confused by the sudden change in her tone. The warm, hopeful atmosphere in the kitchen vanished, replaced by a strange, heavy tension. I handed the envelope to Diane. She turned it over, her eyes narrowing, as she studied the return address printed on the prepaid envelope folded inside. I asked her what was wrong, practically begging her to just let me open the letter. We pulled the contents out together. The first thing that fell onto the counter was a glossy photograph. It was Alyssa smiling brightly, holding a small golden retriever puppy. She looked healthy, happy, and so much like the little girl I used to carry on my shoulders. Beneath the photograph was a handwritten letter spanning 2 full pages. I began to read it aloud, my voice trembling with emotion. "Dad, Mom," she wrote. "I am so sorry for the last 2 years. I have been doing a lot of thinking, and I realized how foolish and stubborn I have been. Craig and I have moved on, and we are doing much better now. I miss you both terribly. I got a new puppy, his name is Buster, and I want you to meet him. I want to start sending you physical photo albums so we can bridge this gap." Attached is a standard contact authorization form the new postal service requires for registered package deliveries. Please sign it and send it back in the prepaid envelope so I can start sending you our family memories again. I love you. Tears spilled down my cheeks. It was everything I had prayed for. She was apologizing. She was doing well. She wanted us back in her life. I felt a massive weight lift from my shoulders. I reached for a pen on the counter, ready to sign whatever postal form she needed to get those photo albums. I would have signed anything in that moment, but Diane didn't reach for a pen. Diane reached for her reading glasses. She picked up the prepaid return envelope that was tucked behind the letter. "George, look at this," she said, pointing a steady finger at the printed text. I wiped my eyes and looked. The return address didn't say Alyssa Sullivan, and it didn't list a residential street in the suburbs where they lived. It said Sullivan and Associates Holding Suite 400, followed by a downtown commercial zip code. Why would our daughter need a legal form sent to a commercial business suite just to mail us pictures of a puppy, Diane asked. The question hung in the air, cold and sharp. My emotional guard, which had completely dissolved just moments before, slammed back into place. The logistics manager in me, the man who had spent 40 years analyzing supply chains and catching discrepancies in massive shipping contracts, instantly recognized an anomaly. Postal services do not require signed contact authorization forms to deliver photo albums, and daughters seeking a heartfelt reconciliation do not route their mail through downtown commercial holding suites. The beautiful illusion of a loving family reunion shattered, leaving behind a cold, clinical suspicion. My hands stopped shaking. The tears dried up. I picked up the single-page document Alyssa had called a simple postal form. It was printed on thick, high-quality paper, entirely out of place next to the handwritten letter. I took the document into my home office, the room where I managed all our finances, our retirement accounts, and our estate planning. I turned on the bright desk lamp and opened the top drawer of my desk, pulling out a heavy-duty magnifying glass I used for reading old maps. I smoothed the paper out on the mahogany wood. The top of the document looked completely innocent. It had spaces for our names, our current address, and our phone numbers, under a bold heading that read, "Package Receiving and Contact Update." But it was the bottom of the page that caught my eye. There was a thick, gray border running along the footer just below the signature line. To the naked eye, it looked like a simple design choice, a generic geometric pattern. But under the bright light of the desk lamp and the magnification of the glass, the gray border resolved into lines of incredibly tiny, densely packed text. It was microprint. I leaned in close, tracing the words line by line. As I read the legal jargon hidden in that tiny font, the blood drained from my face and a cold, sickening horror twisted in my stomach. This was not a postal form. It was a legally binding, irrevocable power of attorney agreement. I read the clauses carefully, my breathing shallow. The fine print explicitly stated that by signing the document, George and Diane Bennett granted Craig Sullivan full, unmitigated administrative access to our primary banking trust. It granted him the right to alter beneficiaries, liquidate assets, and leverage real estate as collateral without requiring our physical presence or verbal consent. The breaking point did not happen with a scream. It happened in absolute, terrifying silence. My daughter had not written a letter to apologize for her past behavior. She had not sent a picture of a puppy to bridge a gap. She had carefully crafted an emotional Trojan horse designed to exploit a father's grief and a mother's desperate hope, all to trick us into handing over the keys to our entire life savings. They didn't even have the courage to look me in the eye to rob me. They tried to do it through the mail. Diane walked into the office and stood behind my chair. She saw the look on my face and placed a hand on my shoulder. "What is it, George?" she asked quietly. I handed her the magnifying glass. "They aren't trying to come home, Diane," I said, my voice eerily calm. "They are trying to steal the house." I watched Diane read the microprint. I watched the hope die in her eyes, replaced by a fierce, protective anger. For a moment, the urge to pick up the phone and scream at Alyssa was overwhelming. I wanted to call her, to curse at Craig, to demand how they could sink so low. But as I sat there in the quiet of my office, a different instinct took over. Confrontation would only lead to them denying it, covering their tracks, and finding a new, sneakier way to attack us. If I raged, I would be the angry, irrational father. They would see me coming. I looked at the fraudulent document, then at the picture of Alyssa and her puppy. The daughter I raised was gone, replaced by a predator willing to leave her parents destitute for a quick payout. They thought I was just a naive, desperate old man who would blindly sign anything to get his little girl back. They severely underestimated who they were dealing with. I closed the desk drawer and looked at my wife. "We are not going to call them," I said. "We are going to give them exactly what they think they want. We are going to play the helpless, technologically inept seniors. We are going to let them think their trap is working. Because true justice isn't about yelling. It is about letting arrogant people dig their own graves and then quietly burying them in it. Silence would be my weapon, and they would never see the counterattack coming." I sat at my mahogany desk for a long time, just staring at the telephone. My heart was heavy, but my mind was crystal clear. If I called Alyssa and yelled, if I demanded to know why she was trying to steal our home, she would hang up. She would deny it, block my number, and find a more sophisticated way to ruin us. I could not let her know that the logistics manager she grew up with, the man who spent his life analyzing details and finding errors, had caught her. I needed her to believe that I was exactly what she hoped for. A tired, failing old man who was desperately lonely and losing his grip on reality. I looked over at Diane. She was standing in the doorway of the office, her arms crossed tight against her chest. I nodded to her, and she gave me a single nod back. We understood each other perfectly. I cleared my throat, forcing the strength out of my posture. I slumped my shoulders, let my jaw go slightly slack, and practiced breathing a little shallower. I needed my voice to sound thin, reedy, and full of breathless gratitude. When I picked up the receiver, my hand was completely steady, but the persona I was building was fragile. I dialed the number I had not called in 2 years. The line rang once, twice, 3 times. I almost thought she would send it to voicemail, but then there was a loud click. Alyssa answered with a cautious, clipped hello. I let out a long, shaky breath right into the mouthpiece. "Alyssa, sweetie," I said, making my voice wobble on her name. "Is that you?" There was a pause on the other end. I could hear the gears turning in her head, evaluating my tone. "Yes, Dad." "It is me," she said, her voice dripping with careful hesitation. I laid the emotion on thick. I told her I received her beautiful letter. I told her how I cried seeing the picture of her and the new puppy. I kept my sentences short and slightly disjointed, like a man overwhelmed by his feelings and struggling to keep his thoughts organized. I thanked her over and over for reaching out, telling her that her mother and I had missed her so terribly that the house felt entirely empty without her. I listened closely to the subtle shifts in her breathing. I could hear the tension leaving her body. The caution in her voice melted away, replaced by a practiced, sugary warmth. "Oh, Dad," she cooed, "I missed you too. I just wanted to put the past behind us. We really want to send you those photo albums. Did you see the postal form I included?" There it was. She did not ask how my health was. She did not ask how Diane was doing. Less than 2 minutes into a reunion call after 2 years of silence, she went straight for the document, that would sign away my life savings. I let out a weak, self-deprecating chuckle followed by a dry cough. "Oh, sweetie," I said, sounding completely defeated. "I was so excited when I read your letter. I was rushing to find a pen to sign that mail paper right away, but I am so clumsy lately. My hands just shake sometimes." I knocked my morning decaf right over the desk. I waited a beat, letting the silence stretch before delivering the hook. It soaked right through the paper, Alyssa. The ink ran everywhere. I tried to wipe it off, but the whole thing tore. I ruined the mail form. "I am so sorry." I heard a sharp intake of breath on her end. For a split second, the facade cracked and a sharp, irritated hiss escaped her lips. But she caught herself immediately. "It is okay, Dad," she said, though her voice was noticeably tighter. "We can just print another one and mail it to you." I knew if she mailed it, she would remain a ghost. I needed her in my house. I needed her to step into the trap in person. I made my voice sound even more pathetic, layering on the confusion. "No, please do not mail it," I pleaded. "The mail takes so long and my eyes have been so terrible lately. I cannot even find my prescription reading glasses. Your mother has been looking all morning. I cannot read a single thing without them." I paused, letting a pathetic tremor enter my words. "Could you come over, Alyssa? Just for dinner. You and Craig. You could bring a fresh copy of that paper. You could read it to me and show me exactly where to put my name, and I will sign it right there at the table. We just want to see you." The silence that followed was heavy with calculation. I could picture her standing in her living room, her eyes wide with the realization of what I was offering. A confused, nearly blind father practically begging to sign a document he could not read with his own hand in his own home. It was the ultimate jackpot for a predator. I heard her cover the receiver with her hand. Muffled voices filtered through the phone. She was talking to Craig. I could hear the urgent, excited cadence of their whispers. They were smelling blood in the water. They genuinely believed I was slipping mentally, that I was an easy mark, ready to be harvested. Alyssa uncovered the phone, and her voice was so sickeningly sweet, it made my stomach turn. "Oh, Dad. That sounds wonderful," she chirped, the excitement completely unmasked now. "Craig and I would love to come over tomorrow night. I will bring a fresh form, and do not worry about a thing. We will take care of it for you. We will take care of everything." I thanked her profusely, acting as though she had just given me the greatest gift in the world. I told her her mother would make her favorite roast, and we exchanged fake loving goodbyes before I gently placed the receiver back on the cradle. The sharp click of the phone disconnecting echoed in the quiet office. I sat there, in the heavy silence, the frail old man persona falling away instantly. My spine straightened, my jaw clenched. The air in the room felt thick with betrayal. Diane stepped fully into the office, her eyes searching my face. "She is coming tomorrow night," I told my wife. "She and Craig are bringing the papers. They think I am going blind and losing my mind." Diane let out a slow breath, shaking her head. It was a devastating victory. We had successfully lured our daughter into our home, but the cost was accepting the stark reality of her monstrous greed. She did not want reconciliation. She wanted a payday, and she was thrilled at the idea of exploiting my supposed mental decline to get it. But the trap was now officially set. They were coming to our house expecting a sheep. They had no idea they were walking into a lion's den. However, I knew that stepping into the ring with predators required more than just a good act. I could not just wait for the doorbell to ring. I needed to understand the mechanics of their desperation. People do not try to steal a lifetime of savings with a fake legal document unless they are running from something terrifying or running towards something huge. I needed absolute leverage. I needed to know every dirty secret Craig Sullivan was hiding behind his cheap suits and failed businesses. I opened my heavy desk drawer again, reaching past the magnifying glass and the ruined, fraudulent document. I pulled out a thick, leather-bound address book that I had kept updated for over 40 years in the logistics business. I bypassed the family contacts, bypassed the friendly neighbors, and flipped straight to the professional section. My finger stopped on a name written in sharp black ink. A man I had worked with decades ago when a shipping contractor tried to embezzle funds from my company. He was not a gentle man. He was a corporate attorney who specialized in tearing apart financial fraud and protecting assets with ruthless efficiency. I picked up the phone again, my hands completely steady, my voice deep and commanding. I needed ammunition before tomorrow night, and I knew exactly who was going to help me load the gun. I dialed a number I had not used in nearly a decade. It belonged to Michael Lawson. Michael was 55 years old, a corporate bulldog I had retained years ago when a vendor tried to embezzle from my logistics firm. Michael did not practice family law. He did not do estate planning. He specialized in financial fraud, asset protection, and destroying people who thought they were smarter than the law. Michael answered on the second ring. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I told him my daughter and her husband were attempting to execute a fraudulent power of attorney using a microprinted commercial document. I told him I needed a full aggressive background check on my son-in-law, Craig Sullivan, and I needed it before dinner tomorrow. Michael asked for Craig's full name, his last known business address, and my daughter's social security number. He told me to sit tight and wait for his call. For the next few hours, Diane and I sat in the living room in silence. The house felt different now. It felt like a fortress waiting for a siege. Every tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway was a reminder that our own flesh and blood was preparing to raid our lives. When the phone finally rang, the sun was just beginning to set, casting long, dark shadows across the hardwood floor. It was Michael. His voice was completely devoid of its usual professional warmth. It was flat, clinical, and deadly serious. George, Michael said, "You need to listen to me very carefully." I ran the asset traces and pulled the public records on Sullivan. I also made a few calls to some colleagues who monitor commercial lending. The situation is much worse than a simple money grab. Your son-in-law is not just a failed businessman, he is radioactive. I leaned forward in my desk chair, pressing the receiver tightly against my ear. "Tell me everything," I demanded. Michael laid out the reality of Craig's life, and with every word, the image of my daughter's husband grew darker. Craig's last two startups were not just failures. They were elaborate shell companies. He had been taking investments from private backers, moving the funds through a maze of offshore accounts, and using the new money to pay off the old investors. He was running a classic Ponzi scheme, but he had gotten sloppy, very sloppy. According to Michael, the federal government had caught wind of the discrepancies. Craig Sullivan was currently the target of an active federal investigation for wire fraud. The authorities had frozen his legitimate business accounts 3 weeks ago. He was completely out of cash, and the walls were closing in fast. But that was not the worst part. When legitimate banks stopped lending to him, Craig had turned to the shadows. He had taken out massive high-interest loans from localized lenders, the kind of people who do not send collection letters in the mail, the kind of people who show up at your front door when you miss a payment. My stomach twisted into a cold knot. Craig was cornered. He was drowning in debt, facing federal prison, and running from violent creditors. But my mind instantly went to Alyssa, my daughter. I desperately wanted to believe that she was a victim in all of this. I wanted to believe that Craig had kept her in the dark, that she was just blindly following her husband, completely unaware of the massive fraud he was committing. I asked Michael the question that had been burning in my chest. "What about Alyssa?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Does she know?" The silence on the other end of the line was heavy. When Michael finally spoke, his words shattered the last remaining fragment of hope I had for my daughter. "George, I am so sorry," Michael said gently. "She does not just know, she is fully complicit. When Craig's credit tanked, he could no longer secure the initial loans to keep his scheme afloat. Alyssa stepped in. She used her maiden name to bypass the credit checks. She co-signed on 3 different fraudulent commercial loans. Her signature is on the federal documents. If Craig goes down, she goes down right beside him. I closed my eyes, feeling a physical ache in my chest. The daughter I had raised, the little girl who used to sit on my lap and help me plant tomatoes in the garden, had willingly signed her name to a federal crime. She was not a manipulated housewife. She was an active participant in a criminal enterprise. The gravity of the situation settled over me like a suffocating blanket. The false contact authorization form, the sudden desperate reconciliation, the picture of the puppy. It was not just greed. It was absolute sheer desperation. Craig and Alyssa were not just trying to steal some extra cash to live a luxurious lifestyle. They were trying to steal my life savings to buy their way out of a federal indictment and pay off violent loan sharks. They were cornered animals, and there is nothing more dangerous in this world than a predator that has been backed into a corner with no way out. They needed a massive injection of untraceable cash, and they needed it immediately. They had looked at their options, looked at the fast-approaching ruin of their lives, and they had made a choice. They chose to sacrifice me. They chose to sacrifice Diane. They were willing to leave us destitute, homeless, and bankrupt in our twilight years, just to save their own skins. Michael continued speaking, his voice pulling me back to the present. George, you need to understand the threat level here. They are not going to take no for an answer. If they do not get access to your banking trust, they are going to prison. They are coming to your house tomorrow night, and they are going to do whatever it takes to get your signature on that document. You cannot just lock the door and ignore them. They will forge your signature. They will falsify medical records to claim you are incompetent. They will tear your life apart piece by piece until they get what they need. I opened my eyes. The sadness was gone. The grief of losing my daughter had been entirely burned away, replaced by a cold, calculating fury. They thought they were the only ones willing to do whatever it takes to survive. They were wrong. What is our next move, Michael? I asked, my voice completely steady. We do not just block them, George. Michael replied, his tone matching my cold resolve. If we just block the power of attorney, they will keep coming. We need to neutralize them completely. We need to let them think they have won right up until the moment the cell door locks behind them. I need you to gather every piece of financial documentation you have in the house. I am drafting a secondary contract tonight. We are going to build a legal snare so tight, they will never even feel the wire around their necks until it is too late. I thanked Michael and ended the call. I sat in the dim light of my office looking at the photographs of my family on the bookshelf. The smiling faces felt like relics from a past life. A life that ended the moment Alyssa decided my survival was an acceptable price to pay for her mistakes. Diane walked into the room holding 2 cups of tea. She set them on the desk and looked at my face. She did not ask if it was bad. She could see it in my eyes. They are desperate, I told her quietly. They are facing federal charges, and they owe money to dangerous people. Alyssa co-signed the loans. They are coming tomorrow to use our house and our trust to buy their way out. Diane did not cry. She did not gasp. She simply reached across the desk and took my hand. Her grip was firm, unyielding. Then we do what we have always done, George, she said, her voice filled with quiet strength. We protect our home. The trap was set. The bait was ready. Tomorrow night, my daughter and her husband would walk into my dining room expecting to find a feeble old man ready to sign his life away. Instead, they would find a man who had spent 40 years mastering the art of logistics, preparation, and total execution. They were hunting a sheep. They had no idea they were walking into a slaughterhouse. I sat back down at my desk, staring at the phone. My heart was a steady drum against my ribs. I thought the worst was over. I thought knowing my daughter was a willing accomplice to a federal crime was the absolute bottom of this nightmare. But Michael Lawson was not finished. My phone rang again. It was Michael. He told me he had dug deeper into the commercial lending registries. He told me he had found the exact catalyst for why that letter arrived in my mailbox this morning. It was not just a proactive scam. It was a desperate reaction to a ticking clock. Michael explained that Craig had not simply planned to steal our money in the future. He had already initiated the theft. 3 days ago, Craig approached a secondary high-risk commercial lending firm. The kind of firm that operates on the very edge of the law, the kind that charges exorbitant interest rates and does not ask too many questions as long as the collateral is solid. Craig applied for a massive bridge loan to pay off the localized loan sharks who were currently breathing down his neck. But because his own credit was destroyed and his federal accounts were frozen, Craig needed a pristine, untouchable asset to back the loan. He used my house. He used the home I bought 30 years ago. The home where Diane and I raised our daughter. The home where every shingle and floorboard was paid for with my sweat and long hours at the logistics plant. Craig had somehow acquired the deed records and presented our primary banking trust and our physical property as the ultimate collateral for his survival. I asked Michael how a bank could possibly approve a loan against a house Craig did not own. Michael told me that they had not approved it yet. They had conditionally approved it. The underwriters had accepted the asset valuation, but they required one final, non-negotiable element. They needed the physical, notarized signature of the property owner or the signature of an individual holding full legal power of attorney. That was the trap. That was the microprint on the bottom of the contact authorization form. Craig had promised the lenders he would have the power of attorney documents finalized and submitted by the end of the week. Then Michael dropped the heaviest weight of all. The lenders gave Craig a strict deadline. Friday. If the notarized signature was not securely in their hands by Friday afternoon, the conditional loan would collapse. The funds would evaporate. And if that money evaporated, Craig and Alyssa would have absolutely nothing left to hold back the violent creditors they owed. The loan sharks would collect their debts in blood, or the federal investigators would finally kick their front door off the hinges and drag them away in handcuffs. It was Wednesday evening. They were coming to my house for dinner on Thursday night. The reality of the timeline settled over me like a heavy winter chill. This was not a casual deception. This was not a greedy couple trying to secure a future inheritance early. It was a hostage situation disguised as a family reunion. Craig and Alyssa were backed against a sheer cliff with the wolves closing in. They had less than 48 hours to deliver my signature, or their entire lives would go up in flames. When you corner an animal, it stops playing by the rules. It stops acting rationally. It bites, it claws, and it destroys anything in its path to survive. That was what my daughter and her husband were bringing to my dining room tomorrow. They were bringing the desperate feral energy of people who had absolutely nothing left to lose. I realized in that moment just how existential the danger truly was. If I simply refused to sign their paper tomorrow night, they would not just sigh and go home. They would not accept defeat. If they left my house without that signature, they were going to prison or worse. They would use any means necessary to get it. They would forge my signature. They would try to declare me mentally incompetent. They might even try to physically harm me or Diane to force our hands. When millions of dollars and federal prison sentences are on the line, people commit unspeakable atrocities. And my own daughter was completely aligned with a man willing to commit them. I walked out of my office and found Diane in the kitchen. She was standing by the sink looking out the window into our backyard. The sun had set, leaving the neighborhood bathed in the quiet amber glow of the streetlights. It looked so peaceful. It looked like the safe, quiet retirement we had earned. But it was an illusion. The war was already at our doorstep. I told Diane everything Michael had just relayed to me. I told her about the bridge loan, the collateral, and the Friday deadline. I watched her process the timeline. I watched her realize that the daughter coming to dinner tomorrow was bringing a ticking time bomb into our sanctuary. Diane turned away from the window. She did not tremble and she did not weep. My wife looked at me with a fierce, unwavering clarity. She told me we could not just play defense anymore. She told me if we just survived tomorrow night, they would simply attack us again on Friday morning. We had to break their teeth. We had to ensure that when they left our house, they had absolutely no ability to ever harm us again. I agreed completely. The logistics manager inside me began calculating the final moves of the operation. In logistics, when a supply chain is compromised by a toxic element, you do not just reroute the shipments. You isolate the toxic element, you lock it in a quarantine zone, and you let it suffocate. We were going to isolate Craig and Alyssa. We were going to let them think they had secured the asset. We were going to let them walk into their lending office on Friday morning, believing they had won. We would give them a signature, but it would not be the one they wanted. It would be a signature that shifted the entire weight of their fraud back onto their own shoulders. I knew I had to move vast sums of money before the sun rose. I knew I had to restructure our entire estate in a matter of hours. I had to drain the very accounts Craig was targeting, so that even if he somehow breached the vault, he would find nothing but dust. I told Diane to get some rest. She needed to be sharp for the performance of a lifetime tomorrow. She needed to play the overjoyed mother, perfectly feeding Alyssa's ego and blinding her to the trap. Diane kissed my cheek, told me she loved me, and went upstairs. I went back into my office and closed the door. I turned on my computer and pulled up my banking portals. I poured a glass of water and set it on the desk next to the phone. The house was completely silent, but inside my head, a clock was ticking loudly. Tick, tick, tick. The countdown to Thursday night had begun. I spent the next several hours mapping out every single asset Diane and I possessed. Every retirement fund, every mutual fund, every equity account. I categorized them by liquidity and transfer speed. I prepared the routing numbers for Michael Lawson so he could establish the offshore holding shells the moment the banks opened. I was dismantling 40 years of financial architecture in a single night, preparing to move it all behind a fortress of impenetrable legal armor. This was no longer just about protecting our money. It was about protecting our lives. My daughter had placed a bounty on our heads to save a criminal. She had traded her family for a fraudster. The pain of that realization was still there, buried deep beneath my ribcage, but I refused to let it govern my actions. Grief is a luxury you can only afford when you are safe. And right now, we were the targets. I looked at the clock on the wall. It was past midnight. Thursday had officially arrived. In less than 18 hours, the doorbell would ring. They would stand on my porch holding a bottle of cheap wine and a document designed to ruin me. They would smile and they would lie, and they would wait for the weak old man to hand over his life. I turned off the desk lamp. The office plunged into darkness. I sat in the dark for a moment, letting my eyes adjust. I felt a cold, hard resolve settle over my entire body. They thought time was on their side. They thought they controlled the board. But I was the one holding the stopwatch now. And when the timer finally hit 0, Craig and Alyssa would learn the most terrifying lesson of their lives. You never try to corner a man who knows exactly how to build a cage. The doorbell chimed at exactly 6:00 clock. The sound echoed through the hallway, sharp and demanding, cutting through the heavy silence of our home. I stood in the kitchen next to Diane. We shared one final look. 40 years of marriage had taught us how to communicate without a single word. Her eyes were resolute, but I could see a slight tremor in her hands as she smoothed the fabric of her apron. We were about to let predators into our sanctuary. I let my shoulders slump, pushed my posture forward to mimic a slight hunch, and shuffled my feet just a little as I walked. Diane took a deep breath, pasted a bright, fragile smile on her face, and opened the front door. Alyssa stood on the porch, holding a bottle of cheap wine. She lunged forward, throwing her arms around Diane in a suffocating embrace. "Oh, Mom, I missed you so much," she cried. Her voice was loud-pitched, artificially high, completely lacking the genuine warmth of a daughter returning to her childhood home. It felt like a community theater performance, rehearsed and hollow. Then she turned to me. She hugged me tight, smelling of expensive perfume that barely masked the scent of utter desperation. I hugged her back, making my arms tremble just a fraction, playing the overwhelmed, weakening father perfectly. Behind her stood Craig. He stepped into the foyer wearing a navy blue suit that practically screamed for attention. To the untrained eye, he looked like a wealthy executive stepping off a private jet. But a logistics manager spends his entire life analyzing details and finding the flaws in a system. I noticed the break of his trousers was too long, the fabric slightly pulling at the seams. It was a high-end designer suit, but it had not been tailored for him. It was bought off the rack on credit, a hollow costume meant to project an empire that simply did not exist. He extended a hand adorned with an oversized, flashy watch. "George," he boomed, flashing a brilliant, empty smile. "It is so good to see you looking well." We moved to the dining room, sitting around the heavy oak table where Alyssa had eaten her childhood meals. Diane served a beautiful pot roast, playing the role of the doting, oblivious mother flawlessly. She heaped potatoes onto Craig's plate, asking him wide-eyed questions about his business ventures. Craig ate the attention up greedily. He spent the entire main course boasting about venture capital, aggressive market expansions, and silent partners in overseas markets. He talked fast, dropping corporate buzzwords to sound incredibly important. I watched my daughter nod along with his lies, her eyes darting nervously toward the grandfather clock in the corner. She was barely touching her food. She was waiting for the payoff. I played my part without missing a beat. I asked Craig to repeat himself several times, cupping my hand around my ear and apologizing for my bad hearing. I deliberately mispronounced the fake numbers he threw out, letting my voice trail off into a confused mumble. Each time I did, I saw Craig exchange a quick, condescending glance with Alyssa. It was a look of profound disrespect. They were sitting at my table, eating the food I provided, and silently mocking the man they thought was rapidly losing his mind. The sheer audacity of their performance was breathtaking. I thought back to all the Thanksgiving dinners we had shared at this very table, all the times I had carved the turkey, while Alyssa laughed and told us about her school day. To see that bright, innocent girl replaced by a woman actively calculating how fast she could liquidate my life savings was an agonizing pill to swallow. It took every ounce of my willpower to keep my hands resting gently on my lap instead of balling them into fists. The conversation remained superficially sweet until Diane cleared the dinner plates and brought out an apple pie for dessert. The moment the pie hit the table, the atmosphere in the dining room shifted. The artificial warmth evaporated, replaced by a clinical, predatory tension. Craig cleared his throat, adjusting his expensive tie, and leaned forward, placing his elbows firmly on the oak table. He adopted a somber, deeply concerned expression, the kind of look a doctor gives a patient before delivering terrible news. "George." Diane, Craig began, his voice dropping to a smooth, comforting baritone. "Alyssa and I have been talking a lot lately about the future, about family. You two have worked so incredibly hard your entire lives. You built a wonderful life here. But the world is changing rapidly, and the financial laws are getting incredibly complicated. We have been consulting with some top-tier wealth managers, and honestly, we are very worried about your estate." I let a look of mild panic wash over my face. I blinked rapidly and looked at Diane, who reached over and patted my hand with practiced anxiety. Worried, I asked, letting my voice crack slightly to show my fear. "What do you mean, Craig? We have our savings. We pay our taxes on time every year." Craig shook his head slowly, wearing a mask of profound pity. "It is not just about paying taxes, George. The government is implementing aggressive new estate tax laws next year. If something were to happen to either of you, probate court would step in immediately. They could freeze your accounts for years. They could take half the value of this house just in inheritance penalties. Alyssa and I cannot bear the thought of you losing everything you built to a bureaucratic loophole." Alyssa reached across the table and placed her hand over mine. Her skin was ice cold, a stark contrast to her warm words. "Dad," she whispered, playing the devoted daughter to absolute perfection. "We just want to protect you. We want to make sure you and Mom never have to worry about money or legal headaches ever again. Craig has a brilliant team. They developed a family legacy strategy that shelters your assets entirely. It puts everything under a protective umbrella so the government cannot touch it. You would never have to deal with the bank again." Craig reached down into his leather briefcase resting by his feet. He pulled out a sleek black folder and placed it gently on the table right next to my slice of apple pie. He opened it, revealing a thick stack of legal documents marked with colorful tabs, indicating where I needed to sign. It was a breathtakingly brazen move. He was not asking for a loan. He was actively trying to assume total control of our financial identity before the coffee even got cold. These are trust formation documents. Craig lied smoothly, tapping the thick stack of paper. By designating me as the administrative director of the Family Legacy Trust, I take on all the legal liability. You retain all your money, but legally the state sees the assets as shielded. It is just a formality, really. A simple administrative transfer to keep you safe and comfortable. I stared down at the documents. I knew exactly what they were. They were the very same papers that would grant him the collateral he desperately needed to save himself from federal prison and violent loan sharks. The condescension in his voice was thick and suffocating. He was speaking to me the way one might speak to a confused toddler. He genuinely believed that a few scary words about the government and a fake smile from my daughter were all it would take for me to hand over 40 years of hard labor. I looked at Diane. She gave me a fearful, trembling look, playing her part to the bitter end. We were trapped in a horrific performance, absorbing their fake affection, waiting for the perfect moment to spring the jaw of the trap shut. I reached out with a trembling hand and pulled the thick black folder closer to my plate. The glossy paper felt heavy, loaded with the weight of their deception. I patted my pockets, acting frantic, muttering about my reading glasses, until Diane gently handed them to me across the table. I slid them onto my nose and squinted at the top page, bringing it agonizingly close to my face. Beneath the heavy oak table right near my knee, a small digital voice recorder was securely taped to the wood. Its tiny red recording light blinked in the dark, capturing every breath, every lie, and every desperate manipulation, bouncing off the dining room walls. I read the first few lines out loud, stumbling over the legal jargon, deliberately mispronouncing words to sound utterly out of my depth. Fiduciary, I mumbled, tasting the syllables as if they were a foreign language. Now, Craig, I am just a retired logistics man. I do not understand all these massive corporate terms. Does this mean the state takes the house if Diane and I get sick? Craig let out a short, practiced chuckle, holding up his hands in a calming gesture. No, George, not at all. It is the exact opposite. The Family Legacy Trust shields the house. It puts a legal wall around your assets so the government cannot touch them. You just designate me as the administrative director, and I handle all the bureaucratic nonsense for you. I nodded slowly, keeping my mouth slightly open to maintain the dull, confused expression. But Craig, I said, tapping the paper with a shaking finger, if you are the director, does that mean you own our house now? Do Diane and I become your tenants? I saw a muscle feather in Craig's jaw, the first tiny crack in his polished veneer. No, George, he said, his voice tightening just a fraction. It is purely administrative. You and Diane still live here. You still own everything. I just manage the liability. I let a few seconds of heavy silence pass. Then I flipped the page, stared at it for a long moment, and looked back up at him. But Craig, I asked again, my voice innocent and frail. If you manage the liability, does that mean the bank sends the mortgage deed to your office instead of here? Craig shifted in his seat. The fabric of his cheap suit rubbed against the chair. George, the deed goes into the trust. The trust holds the deed. It is a protective measure. I am simply the key holder. I frowned, scratching my chin. So you hold the key to our house? Alyssa shifted nervously, her eyes darting between her husband and me. Dad, she interjected, her voice strained. Craig is just trying to explain the legal structure. It is very standard. This was the moment Diane stepped in, playing her role with terrifying perfection. She reached across the table and placed her hand over mine, giving it a gentle, silencing pat. Oh, George, stop fussing and asking the same things over and over, she chided gently. Look at Craig. Just look at him. He is a highly successful executive. Look at that beautiful suit he is wearing. Look at that expensive watch. Diane turned her gaze to Craig, her eyes wide with manufactured awe. We are just so incredibly lucky that a man as successful as you is willing to take time out of his busy schedule to help two old fools figure out their retirement. You must manage millions of dollars every single day. We should just trust your expertise." I watched Craig swallow the bait whole. The frustration in his eyes instantly melted into raw, unadulterated arrogance. His chest puffed out. He adjusted his collar, his posture straightening as he absorbed my wife's flattery. He believed her completely. He believed he was the smartest man in the room, outwitting two simple, aging suburbanites. "Well," Diane Craig said, a smug, self-satisfied smirk spreading across his face. "You are absolutely right. My firm is handling massive international acquisitions right now. I deal with offshore accounts and tax shelters that most regular accountants do not even know exist. I am doing this as a personal favor to you and George because you are family. But I really need you to sign these documents tonight." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a sleek, expensive-looking pen, sliding it across the table until it rested right against the signature line of the contract. I stared at the pen, then looked back up at Craig, letting my eyes widen in fear. "Tonight," I asked, my voice quivering. "Oh, I just do not know, Craig. It is so late. My eyes are so incredibly tired from reading all day. This is a very thick stack of papers. Maybe I should just take these down to the local bank on Monday and have the manager look them over. Or maybe I could call that nice lawyer who helped us with our wills 10 years ago." The mention of a lawyer was like a physical blow to Craig. The smug arrogance vanished, replaced by an instant raw panic. He leaned forward, bracing his forearms against the table, completely invading my personal space. The scent of his expensive cologne mixed with the sharp, sour smell of nervous sweat. "George, we absolutely do not have time for a local bank manager or some small-town lawyer," Craig said, his voice dropping into a harsh, aggressive whisper. "My business partners have a very strict deadline on this trust formation. We are locking in a highly beneficial tax rate for your estate, but the federal filing window closes tomorrow. If we delay this until next week, the government is going to penalize your savings. You will lose hundreds of thousands of dollars to probate taxes if you do not sign this right now." I shrank back in my chair, pressing my spine against the wood, acting as though his sudden aggression terrified me. "But Craig," I stammered, "surely the federal government can wait one more weekend. I just want to be sure I am not giving away my home." Craig's face flushed a deep, angry red. The smooth corporate facade was completely gone, leaving only the desperate, cornered animal underneath. The man sitting across from me was not a successful entrepreneur. He was a fraudster staring down federal prison and violent loan sharks, and I was the only thing standing between him and total destruction. "George, sign the paper!" Craig demanded, his voice thick with poorly contained rage. "I am trying to save your life. Do not ruin this, because you are too stubborn to understand how the real world works. Just pick up the pen and sign your name." Alyssa looked terrified. She reached out and grabbed Craig's forearm, her fingers digging into his suit jacket. "Craig, please," she whispered frantically. "You are scaring him. Just give him a minute to read it." I sat in the heavy, suffocating silence of the dining room, looking at my daughter and her husband. The psychological warfare was working perfectly. I had pushed Craig to the absolute edge of losing his temper in my own home. Every aggressive demand, every desperate lie, and every condescending threat was being captured in crystal-clear audio by the recorder taped beneath us. They were digging their own graves with every word they spoke. I just needed to push them one step further. I needed to move the battlefield out of my house and into theirs. I stared at the pen resting on the table. My hand hovered over the polished metal. I let my fingers shake just enough to make Alyssa reach out and touch my arm again. "Dad," she whispered, her voice layered with fake sympathy. "Please just sign it. It is for your own good." I looked from the pen to Craig. I kept my breathing shallow and my eyes wide like a frightened child. I pulled my hand back and let it fall into my lap. "I just do not understand, Craig," I mumbled softly. "You said the government needs this, but the government does not use private partners. Who exactly is rushing you? Who are these partners that need my house tonight?" Craig slammed his hand onto the dining room table. The heavy oak shuddered. The silver forks clattered against the porcelain plates. Alyssa jumped in her seat and let out a small, terrified gasp. Craig leaned heavily over the table, bringing his face mere inches from mine. The veins bulged against his stiff white collar. He had completely lost the smooth corporate executive mask. He was now a desperate and angry man, yelling at a confused senior citizen. "I am not dealing with the federal government." "George," Craig snapped, his voice dripping with raw venom. "I am dealing with Apex Vanguard Capital. They are a private equity lending firm, and they hold the paper on this trust. They require your signature to finalize the underwriting, and if they do not have it tomorrow, the entire portfolio collapses." There it was. Apex Vanguard Capital. The exact predatory lending firm Michael Lawson had identified during our background check earlier that afternoon. Craig had just handed me the final piece of the puzzle. He had spoken the name of his shadow lenders out loud. He had just admitted that the Family Legacy Trust was actually tied to a private commercial loan. And the hidden digital recorder taped beneath the table had captured every single syllable in crystal clear audio. He had just confessed to attempting to leverage my home for his own private debt. I looked at Craig. I let the silence hang in the air for a long, heavy moment. Then I slowly sat back in my chair. I let my shoulders relax. I let out a long, theatrical sigh of relief. "Apex Vanguard Capital," I said, pronouncing the name slowly and with deep reverence. "Oh, Craig, why did you not just say so in the first place? I read about them in a financial magazine last month. They only deal with top-tier executives. I had no idea you were managing accounts at that level." Craig blinked rapidly. The sudden shift in my demeanor caught him completely off guard. The hot rage in his eyes flickered. It was replaced immediately by confusion, and then inevitably by his overwhelming ego. He slowly sat back down in his chair and adjusted his suit jacket, trying to recover his professional composure. "Yes, George," he said, his voice smoothing back out into its arrogant tone. "They are highly exclusive. That is why this paperwork is so incredibly urgent." I picked up the pen and twirled it between my fingers. I looked at Diane and gave her the slightest imperceptible nod. Diane clasped her hands together and beamed at our son-in-law. "George," she said, her voice bubbling with manufactured excitement, "we simply cannot sign a document this important at the kitchen table. It feels so informal and rushed. We should do this properly." I turned back to Craig and smiled warmly. "Your mother is absolutely right, Craig. I am so incredibly proud of the man my daughter married. Dealing with firms like Apex Vanguard is just remarkable. I want to sign this document, but I want to do it at your office. I want to see where you work. I want to see the empire you are building. We can come by first thing tomorrow morning." I watched a flash of pure panic cross Craig's face. He did not have a real office. His legitimate businesses were frozen by federal investigators. He was operating out of a cheap rented commercial suite to keep up appearances. Alyssa opened her mouth to protest. I knew she was going to make an excuse about the office being renovated, but Craig held up his hand to stop her. His greed and his desperation were at war with his caution. But the ticking clock was too loud. The loan sharks and the feds were breathing down his neck. He needed that signature before Friday, and I was offering it to him on a silver platter for tomorrow morning. Craig forced a tight, brilliant smile. "That sounds wonderful, George," he said, his voice dripping with fake humility. "I would be honored to host you and Diane at the suite. 10 o'clock tomorrow morning would be perfect. We can handle the signing, and then I will give you the grand tour." I nodded eagerly and placed the pen back on top of the black folder. "It is a date," I told him. The rest of the evening was a masterclass in deception. The heavy tension evaporated, replaced by sickeningly sweet family banter. Craig apologized for raising his voice, blaming the stress of high-level corporate negotiations. I waved it off and played the forgiving, understanding father. When it was time for them to leave, we walked them to the front door. Alyssa hugged me tight and kissed my cheek. "Thank you, Dad," she whispered. "You are making the best decision for our family." I hugged her back, feeling nothing but cold resolve. I told her I loved her, knowing it was the very last time I would ever speak those words to her. We stood on the porch and watched them walk to their car. Craig opened the passenger door for Alyssa, playing the perfect gentleman. They got in, started the engine, and pulled out of the driveway. Diane and I stood shoulder to shoulder in the cool night air. We watched the red glow of their taillights disappear down the street until they were entirely swallowed by the darkness. The moment the car was completely out of sight, the fragile dotting parent act dropped from both of us. I turned and walked back into the dining room. I reached under the heavy oak table and peeled the digital voice recorder from the wood. I pressed the stop button, and the tiny red light went dark. I held the device in my palm. It felt incredibly heavy. It was not just a piece of plastic. It was a loaded weapon containing the exact name of the shadow lending firm, a confession of high pressure, financial coercion, and the irrefutable proof of my son-in-law's criminal desperation. I picked up the phone from my desk and dialed Michael Lawson. He answered immediately. I told him the dinner was over. I told him Craig had lost his temper and explicitly named Apex Vanguard Capital on the tape. Michael let out a low, satisfied breath. He told me the offshore transfers were complete, my primary accounts were entirely empty, and the liability contract was fully drafted. The financial snare was absolutely perfect. I told Michael we were meeting Craig at his commercial office suite at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning. Michael said he would have the plainclothes financial fraud detectives briefed and ready to move. We were no longer defending our home. We were taking the battle directly to their territory. The illusion of family was dead. Tomorrow, the trap would snap shut. The sun had not yet risen when I sat back down at my mahogany desk. The house was wrapped in the quiet stillness of early morning, but my mind was operating with absolute precision. I had a cup of black coffee steaming beside my keyboard. On the screen in front of me were the banking portals I had used for decades. I picked up the phone and dialed Michael Lawson. He answered immediately. He was already at his firm with his team of financial architects standing by. We did not exchange pleasantries. We initiated a surgical financial strike. I gave Michael the authorization codes. I watched my computer monitor as decades of hard labor began to vanish from my primary accounts. The retirement funds I had meticulously built as a logistics manager disappeared. The mutual funds and equity accounts were drained. Michael and his team funneled every single liquid asset I possessed through a secure wire transfer. The money crossed international borders in seconds. It landed safely inside a heavily guarded offshore holding company that Michael had established overnight. I refreshed my banking portal. The screen loaded a new set of numbers. The primary trust account that Craig Sullivan was targeting to save himself from federal prison now held a balance of absolute zero. But the money was only half the battle. The physical house was the true prize Craig desperately needed to secure his predatory commercial loan. Michael had prepared a masterstroke to neutralize that threat. Over the encrypted phone line, he walked me through the electronic execution of an irrevocable trust document. This was not a standard family trust. It was a fortress. By applying my digital signature, I legally bound our home into a corporate structure. Michael explained the brilliant mechanics of the snare. If anyone attempted to alter the deed or use the property as collateral, they would hit an impenetrable legal wall. The trust required the physical notarized signatures of 3 independent board members to authorize any changes. I was no longer the sole decision-maker on paper. Even if Craig forced me to sign his fraudulent power of attorney, it would be legally worthless. The house was completely locked down and utterly untouchable. I printed the final confirmation receipts and slid them into the bottom drawer of my desk. The trap was fully armed. The bait I was walking into the office with was nothing more than an empty shell. I had successfully dismantled my entire financial identity and rebuilt it behind bulletproof glass in less than 12 hours. I walked into the kitchen and found Diane standing by the counter. She was dressed in a simple floral blouse and sensible shoes, looking exactly like a vulnerable grandmother preparing for a family outing. I told her the transfers were complete. I told her the accounts were empty and the house was safe. Diane let out a slow, steady breath and nodded. The fear that had hovered in her eyes the night before was entirely gone. She poured her coffee and we stood together in the kitchen, waiting for the clock to dictate our next move. We had to walk into the belly of the beast. We had to drive across town, step into the fake commercial office Craig was renting, and sit across from the man who was actively trying to ruin us. And we had to do it all with a smile. I had to put the mask of the confused, feeble senior back on. I had to let my daughter rub my shoulders and tell me she loved me while I held the knowledge of her betrayal in my pocket. I grabbed my car keys from the counter. The tension in my chest was heavy, but my resolve was absolute. We walked out the front door and stepped into the crisp morning air. It was time to give my son-in-law exactly what he asked for. The drive to the commercial district took exactly 24 minutes. I kept my eyes on the road, navigating the morning traffic, with the careful, cautious grip of an elderly man while Diane sat silently beside me. We pulled into the parking lot of a sleek glass and steel building. It looked impressive from the outside. It looked like the kind of place where millions of dollars moved through fiber optic cables every second. But I knew better. It was just a shiny shell. We took the elevator up to the 4th floor. The doors slid open to a quiet, carpeted hallway. We walked down the corridor until we reached a frosted glass door with the words Sullivan and Associates Holdings printed on a cheap vinyl decal. It was not engraved. It was not permanent. It was something that could be peeled off in seconds when the feds finally came knocking. I opened the door and ushered Diane inside. The reception area was entirely empty. There was a sleek, modern desk, but no receptionist. There were no ringing phones, no assistants hurrying down the halls, no hum of a legitimate business. The walls were painted a stark white, and the smell of fresh industrial carpet cleaner hung heavy in the air. It was a ghost ship, a short-term rental designed strictly to create the illusion of an empire. Craig emerged from a back room wearing the same forced, arrogant smile from the night before. He wore a crisp gray suit and walked with the exaggerated confidence of a man who believed he was moments away from total victory. Right behind him was Alyssa carrying a tray with 4 ceramic coffee mugs, and standing quietly in the corner of the room was a third person, a tall, thin man in a rumpled brown suit clutching a leather briefcase. Craig stepped forward and extended his hand. I took it, letting my grip remain weak and hesitant. "Welcome to the firm," George Craig boomed, his voice echoing slightly in the hollow room. "We are so glad you and Diane could make it down here. Let us head straight into my personal office and get you taken care of." We followed him into a larger room at the back. There was a massive faux mahogany desk, positioned in the center, 2 uncomfortable leather guest chairs, and absolutely nothing else. No family photos, no filing cabinets, no real work. Craig gestured to the thin man in the brown suit. "George, Diane, I want to introduce you to Marcus. He is a state-certified notary public. I brought him in specially today so we could legally finalize your legacy trust without you having to wait in line at a busy courthouse. It is all about white-glove service for family." I looked at Marcus. He did not meet my eyes. He gave a quick, nervous nod and kept his hands firmly planted on his briefcase. A man who spent 40 years in corporate logistics knows what a certified legal professional looks like. Marcus was not a notary. He was a hired actor. A street-level associate Craig had likely paid a few $100s out of pocket to come stand in a rented room and stamp a fraudulent piece of paper with a fake seal. The sheer desperation of the setup was almost pathetic. I sat down heavily in one of the leather guest chairs, letting out a long, weary sigh, as if the simple walk from the elevator had drained all my energy. Diane sat next to me, clutching her purse tightly in her lap, playing the anxious but supportive wife. Alyssa walked up behind my chair. She set the coffee mugs on the desk and then placed both her hands on my shoulders. She began to massage the muscles at the base of my neck. Her hands were cold. "Dad," she whispered softly, leaning down so her voice was right by my ear. "I am so proud of you for doing this. You have worked so hard your entire life. Now you can finally just relax and let Craig handle the heavy lifting. This is going to secure our family forever." Her words were meant to sound sweet, but they felt like venom dripping directly into my veins. The daughter I had loved and protected was standing behind me, physically caressing my shoulders while orchestrating my total financial ruin. She was looking at the back of my head, seeing nothing but a stepping stone to save herself from federal prison. I forced myself to lean back into her touch. I let out a soft, appreciative hum, as if her fake affection was the greatest comfort in the world. "Thank you, sweetie," I mumbled. "I just want everything to be safe." Craig sat down behind the massive desk. He unclasped his briefcase and pulled out the thick black folder from the night before. He placed it squarely in the center of the desk, right in front of me. He opened it, revealing the crisp white pages of the irrevocable power of attorney document. The microprint at the bottom was still there, a dense web of legal theft waiting for a drop of ink to bring it to life. He uncrossed his hands and slid a heavy silver pen across the polished wood. "There it is, George," Craig said, his voice smooth and hypnotic. "The key to your peace of mind. Marcus here has already reviewed the standard clauses. All we need is your signature on the bottom line of the first page and your initials on the following 3. Then the state acknowledges me as the fiduciary director, and your assets are officially sheltered from the government." I stared down at the documents. I did not reach for the pen right away. I let my hands rest on my lap, letting them tremble just a fraction. I looked around the room. I was sitting in a fake office surrounded by predators. My son-in-law was a fraudster staring down violent loan sharks. The man in the corner was a fake legal official brought in to legitimize a crime. And my own daughter was standing right behind me, whispering lies into my ear, waiting to inherit the ashes of my life. I was completely surrounded in the belly of the beast. To anyone else looking at this scene, I was a trapped, helpless old man, about to sign away 40 years of sweat and blood. But as I sat there listening to Craig breathe, listening to Alyssa whisper, looking at the fake notary, I felt absolutely no fear. I slowly reached out and placed my fingertips on the edges of the black folder. I felt the thick paper against my skin. I knew that every single account this document tried to access was completely drained. I knew my home was already locked behind an impenetrable corporate trust. Craig was handing me a loaded gun and pointing it at his own chest. He just did not know that I was the one holding the safety catch. I let out a long, trembling breath and slowly picked up the heavy silver pen. I held the heavy silver pen over the bottom line of Craig's fraudulent document. The ink tip hovered just a fraction of an inch above the crisp white paper. I could hear Craig holding his breath. I could feel Alyssa's cold fingers digging slightly into my shoulders in her desperate anticipation. I let my hand shake. I tapped the pen against the desk twice, then slowly laid it down next to the open folder. "Oh dear," I mumbled, letting a heavy, confused sigh rattle deep in my chest. I almost completely forgot. My memory is just terrible these days. Craig exhaled sharply. The sound was a mixture of suffocated rage and sheer panic. "George," he said, his voice tight and vibrating with forced patience. "What is the problem? We are right at the finish line. Just sign the paper and your family is completely protected." I reached into my inner jacket pocket and pulled out a single neatly folded document. I smoothed it out on the desk right next to his massive black folder. "Well, Craig," I said, keeping my eyes wide and entirely innocent. "I woke up so early this morning, and I was just so nervous about doing everything correctly. I actually stopped by my local bank branch right when they opened. I just wanted to make sure they knew you were going to be handling the big transfers." Alyssa's hands instantly vanished from my shoulders. Craig turned a sickly shade of gray. "You went to the bank." Craig choked out the polished executive mask, slipping completely off his face. "George, why would you do that? I told you I handle all the banking." I nodded eagerly, giving him a wide, oblivious smile. I know I did. And I told the bank manager exactly what you said. I told him my brilliant son-in-law was setting up a family legacy trust through Apex Vanguard Capital. I told him you were going to be the fiduciary director." Craig looked like he was about to pass out. He gripped the edge of the desk so hard his knuckles turned white. But I quickly slid the single piece of paper toward him before he could speak. The bank manager was actually incredibly helpful. I continued, my voice bubbling with fake relief. He said that since we are transferring the primary trust assets into your corporate control, the bank just needs a simple authorization release for their internal records. He called it a liability transfer agreement. He said it just proves to the federal regulators that your holding company is legally accepting the portfolio. He told me that once you sign this one single page, they will release the funds immediately without any red tape. Craig stared at the paper. His chest was heaving. He was a cornered animal doing rapid math in his head. He was terrified that I went to the bank, but the sheer gravitational pull of the money was blinding him. He heard the words "release the funds immediately," and his greed completely overrode his basic survival instinct. He did not know that the bank manager I spoke to was actually Michael Lawson. He did not know that the document sitting in front of him was a lethally precise legal snare. The paper was printed on standard bank letterhead to look like bureaucratic fluff, but buried in the dense legal jargon was a binding admission. By signing that paper, Craig was legally forcing his own limited liability company to assume all prior tax liabilities and localized debts attached to my primary accounts, accounts that I had entirely emptied just hours ago. He was signing a legally binding confession of his attempt to assume control of my assets, providing irrefutable notarized proof of his fraud. Craig snatched the paper off the desk. His eyes darted back and forth across the page, but he was not really reading. He was just scanning. He was looking for the signature line. He was too desperate to read the fine print, and far too arrogant to believe a feeble old man could hand him anything dangerous. "This is standard compliance protocol," Craig muttered mostly to himself, desperately trying to regain his posture. He pulled a pen from his own suit pocket. The banks always want to cover their own liability. "This is perfectly fine, George. Good thinking, actually. This will expedite the underwriting by at least a day." Without a second thought, Craig Sullivan pressed his pen to the paper and signed his full legal name. He slid the document over to the fake notary standing in the corner. The thin man in the brown suit quickly stamped it and scribbled his own illegible signature across the bottom. Craig let out a massive, shuddering breath of relief. He slid the document back to me and tapped his own black folder. "Excellent," he smiled, the smug arrogance flooding right back into his face. "Now let us get your signature on the trust documents, George, and we can all go celebrate." I reached out and took the liability transfer agreement. I folded it perfectly in half and tucked it safely back into my inside jacket pocket. I felt the crisp paper resting against my chest. The trap had officially snapped shut. Craig had just locked himself inside a burning building, and he had absolutely no idea. I looked down at his fraudulent power of attorney papers, and then I looked back up at the man who had tried to steal my life. The performance was over. It was time to drop the act. I stared at the heavy black folder sitting on the desk. Craig used 2 fingers to slide it just a fraction of an inch closer to me. He tapped the heavy silver pen against the pristine white paper right next to the line where my name was supposed to go. The air in the rented office felt completely stagnant. I could hear the faint, rapid breathing of my daughter standing just over my shoulder. I could see the greedy, hungry anticipation burning in Craig's eyes. They thought they had crossed the finish line. I slowly reached out and picked up the pen. The metal was cool to the touch. I positioned the tip just a millimeter above the signature line. Craig leaned in, his eyes locked onto the point of the pen like a predator watching its prey step into a snare. Alyssa let out a tiny, involuntary sigh of victory. I held the pen there for 3 agonizingly long seconds, and then very deliberately I pulled my hand back. I set the silver pen down on the faux mahogany desk. It rolled an inch and stopped with a soft click. I did not say a word at first. I simply let the silence expand. I took a deep, steadying breath. I let the frail, trembling facade I had worn for the last 48 hours melt away completely. I pushed my shoulders back, feeling my spine straighten and lock into place. I stopped the artificial tremor in my hands, resting them flat and solid against the armrests of my chair. I lifted my chin and looked Craig directly in the eyes. The transformation was instantaneous. I was no longer the confused, failing senior citizen they had been manipulating all evening. I was the man who had spent 4 decades commanding logistics fleets, negotiating cutthroat corporate contracts, and dismantling supply chain failures with ruthless precision. "I am not signing your document, Craig," I said. My voice did not shake. It was deep, resonant, and entirely commanding. It echoed in the hollow, cheap walls of the rented office suite. Craig blinked rapidly. The smug, victorious grin frozen on his face faltered, cracking just around the edges. He tried to quickly recover his professional posture, letting out a nervous, patronizing chuckle. "Now, George," he stammered, his voice lacking its previous smooth confidence. "We just went over all of this. The bank just took your liability form. We have to finish the trust so the government does not seize the property. It is just a formality." I did not break eye contact. "There is no family legacy trust," I replied, keeping my tone ice cold and perfectly level. "There is no protective umbrella, and there is absolutely no federal filing window closing today." Alyssa stepped back from my chair. I could feel the sudden absence of her presence. "Dad, what are you talking about?" she asked, her voice pitching up into a shrill, nervous register. "You are just getting confused again. Please let Craig help you." I turned my head slowly and looked at the daughter I had raised. Her sickly, sweet smile had completely vanished. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with a sudden, dawning terror. "I am not confused, Alyssa," I told her. "I have not been confused for a single second since I opened that deceptive envelope yesterday morning. I saw the commercial return address. I used a magnifying glass to read the microprint you tried to hide in the margins of your contact form. I know exactly what this is." I turned my attention back to Craig. He was gripping the edge of the desk, his knuckles turning stark white. He looked like a man who had just stepped onto a landmine and heard the trigger click. "You are attempting to execute an irrevocable power of attorney," I stated, laying out the facts with clinical detachment. "You are trying to steal the deed to my home to use as collateral for a high-risk commercial loan. You need my signature because your shadow lenders at Apex Vanguard Capital gave you a strict Friday deadline, and you are utterly out of options." The silence that followed was absolute. The fake notary standing in the corner shifted nervously, his eyes darting toward the door as he realized he had just walked into something highly illegal and deeply dangerous. Craig's face drained of all color, and then immediately flushed a dark, furious crimson. The cheap executive mask he had worn since he walked into my house the night before completely disintegrated. He did not look like a successful businessman anymore. He looked exactly like what he was, a desperate, cornered fraudster whose grand illusion had just been shattered by the very man he thought was an easy mark. Alyssa let out a sharp, angry breath. The loving, doting daughter routine dropped away, revealing the entitled, resentful woman hiding underneath. "You spied on us," she accused, her voice dripping with sudden, venomous hostility. "You went through our things. How do you know about Apex Vanguard?" "I did not spy on anyone," I replied, my voice steady and unyielding. "Your husband was arrogant enough to scream their name out loud in my dining room last night. You both believed I was too old and too stupid to understand what you were doing. You thought you could smile and manipulate your way into my bank accounts. You thought you could leave your mother and me completely destitute just to save yourselves." Craig stood up so fast his heavy leather chair slammed into the wall behind him. The sudden violence of the movement was meant to be intimidating. He planted both his hands flat on the desk, looming over me, his eyes burning with a wild, uncontrollable panic. "You do not understand what is at stake here, George," he hissed, his voice raw and aggressive. "You are going to sign that document right now. You are not walking out of this office until you do." I did not flinch. I did not move a single muscle. I just sat there looking up at him with absolute, unwavering calm. I had spent my entire life building a fortress to protect my family, and I was certainly not going to let this desperate thief tear it down. The ambush they thought they had planned had just become their worst nightmare. I looked up at Craig looming over me with his hands planted firmly on the faux mahogany desk. He was breathing heavily, his chest heaving with desperate anger. He had just threatened me, telling me I was not walking out of his offices until I signed away my life. I did not shrink back. I let a very small, very cold smile touch the corners of my mouth. I told him he was right about one thing. I told him someone was definitely not walking out of this office today, but it was not going to be me. Craig froze. The absolute certainty in my voice completely derailed his momentum. He stood up slowly, the aggressive posture melting into profound confusion. Alyssa stepped out from behind my chair, her eyes darting nervously between her husband and me. I told Craig he could stop worrying about Apex Vanguard Capital and their strict federal filing windows. I told him he could stop sweating over my signature on his fraudulent power of attorney papers. I explained that the primary banking trust he was trying to access to save himself from prison was completely empty. Craig stared at me, his mouth opening and closing without making a sound. Alyssa let out a sharp gasp. I kept my voice perfectly level, delivering the facts with the precision of a logistics manager dismantling a failed supply chain. I told them that while they were busy printing fake legal documents and hiring actors to play notaries, I was on the phone with a ruthless corporate attorney. I explained that before the sun even came up this morning, I moved every single liquid asset I possessed into a secure offshore holding company. The account Craig desperately needed to collateralize his commercial loan held a balance of absolute zero. Furthermore, I told them my house was no longer mine to give away. I explained that I had legally bound the physical property into an irrevocable corporate trust. It now required the physical signatures of 3 independent board members to alter the deed or use the estate as collateral. I looked Craig dead in the eye and told him that even if he held a weapon to my head and forced me to sign his paper, the state would reject it. The house was entirely locked down and utterly untouchable. Craig staggered backward as if I had physically struck him. His legs hit the edge of his leather chair and he collapsed into it. The color completely drained from his face, leaving him a sickly ashen gray. He looked down at his black folder, the realization washing over him that he had spent the last 2 days hunting a ghost. But I was not finished. I reached out and tapped my index finger against the single piece of paper he had eagerly signed just moments ago. The paper he thought was a simple bank release form to expedite his theft. I told Craig to read the fine print on the liability transfer agreement he had just endorsed. I explained that the document was drafted by my attorney specifically for him. By signing his legal name and having his fake notary stamp it, Craig had just legally forced his own limited liability company to assume all prior tax liabilities and localized debts attached to my empty accounts. But more importantly, I told him the document served as a binding, notarized confession. He had just provided irrefutable written proof of his attempt to assume control of a senior citizen's financial assets through coercion. He had signed his own arrest warrant. Alyssa let out a blood-curdling scream. The sound tore through the quiet office space, raw and unhinged. The facade of the sweet, doting daughter completely shattered, revealing the entitled, malicious predator hiding underneath. She lunged forward, slamming her hands onto the desk. She pointed a shaking finger at my face and accused me of being a monster. She screamed that I had tricked them, that I had set them up to be ruined on purpose. She yelled that a real father would have just given them the money to save them from their debts. Her voice cracked as she blamed me for their entire collapse, screaming that I was destroying her family because I was too selfish to part with my wealth. She demanded to know how I could be so cruel as to sit in my dining room and lie to her face. I did not raise my voice to match her hysteria. I did not flinch at her insults. I simply reached into my inside jacket pocket and pulled out my smartphone. I tapped the screen, maximized the volume, and pressed play. The audio from our dining room the night before filled the rented commercial suite. Craig's voice echoed off the bare white walls, loud and aggressive. The recording captured him losing his temper, screaming about Apex Vanguard Capital, admitting the high-pressure coercion, and demanding I sign the papers to save my estate from a fabricated tax penalty. The digital recording was crystal clear. It captured every lie, every threat, and every piece of psychological warfare they had waged against me in my own home. I let the audio play, letting them hear their own monstrous behavior played back to them. I told Alyssa that I did not trick them. I simply gave them enough rope to hang themselves, and they gladly tied the noose. I told her that she lost the right to call me her father the moment she co-signed fraudulent loans and decided my survival was an acceptable price to pay for her mistakes. Craig stared at the phone resting on the desk in absolute horror. The sound of his own voice confessing to extortion broke whatever was left of his mind. The reality of his complete destruction snapped his remaining restraint. With a guttural, furious roar, Craig lunged across the faux mahogany desk. He swept his arms forward violently, knocking the ceramic coffee mugs onto the floor, where they shattered into pieces. He was reaching desperately for my phone and the signed liability form resting near my elbow. He wanted to tear the evidence to shreds. He wanted to destroy the paperwork that was going to send him to a federal penitentiary for the next decade. I leaned back in my chair, pulling the document entirely out of his reach as he scrambled over the polished wood. But before Craig could climb fully across the desk, the heavy frosted glass door of the office suite swung open with a loud, authoritative crash. The frosted glass door hit the interior wall with a violent slam. Craig froze halfway across the mahogany desk. He slowly turned his head toward the entrance. Michael Lawson stood in the doorway, looking like an executioner in a tailored suit. Flanking Michael were two solidly built men wearing unassuming plainclothes. They did not look like corporate clients. They carried the heavy, unmistakable presence of federal law enforcement. Michael stepped into the room, and his voice cut through the stagnant air like a blade. He told Craig to step off the desk and move away from his client immediately. Craig scrambled backward. His expensive shoes slipped on the spilled coffee. He raised his hands in a pathetic gesture of surrender. The fake notary in the corner tried to quietly slide his briefcase toward the exit. One of the plainclothes detectives simply raised a hand and pointed at a chair. The notary sat down instantly, completely terrified. The lead detective pulled a leather wallet from his inner jacket pocket and let it fall open. The golden badge caught the harsh fluorescent light of the office. He did not ask Craig about the fraudulent power of attorney. He did not ask about the empty trust accounts or the dining room coercion. The snare Michael Lawson and I had built was much deeper than a simple local dispute. The detective read Craig his rights. He stated that Craig Sullivan was being placed under arrest for federal wire fraud, interstate financial crimes, and racketeering. Michael stepped forward and explained that the audio recording from the night before provided the exact missing link the federal investigators needed. By explicitly naming his shadow lenders and signing the liability assumption document this morning, Craig had inadvertently provided the federal authorities with a signed confession tying his shell companies to illegal commercial syndicates. Craig did not fight back. The arrogance that had fueled him for 2 years completely evaporated. The detective grabbed him by the shoulder and spun him around. Craig's pristine jacket wrinkled as his arms were pulled roughly behind his back. The sharp metallic click of the handcuffs ratcheting shut echoed loudly off the bare white walls. The sound signaled the absolute end of his criminal empire. Craig kept his head bowed, his shoulders shaking as the reality of a decade in federal prison finally crushed him. Alyssa watched her husband being shackled. The color had entirely left her face. She looked at the federal agents, and then she looked at me. The full weight of her situation crashed down upon her. With Craig going to prison and her name co-signed on his fraudulent loans, she was staring at absolute bankruptcy and potential accessory charges. She had absolutely nothing left. She turned to her mother. Alyssa dropped to her knees right there on the cheap industrial carpet. The tears that streamed down her face were no longer fake. They were the desperate, panicked tears of a woman who had just watched her entire world burn to the ground. She reached out and grabbed the hem of Diane's floral blouse. "Mom, please," Alyssa sobbed, her voice cracking with pathetic desperation. "You have to help me." I did not know what he was doing. Craig manipulated me. He told me we would lose everything if I did not help him get the house. "I am your daughter. You are my parents. You have to get me a lawyer. You have to take me home." I stood up from my chair. I watched the woman I had raised beg for salvation from the very people she had tried to ruin. I waited for my wife to react. For 2 days, Diane had played the fragile, oblivious senior perfectly. She had absorbed every condescending remark and every fake display of affection. Now she dropped the act entirely. Diane looked down at the woman weeping at her feet. She did not reach out to stroke Alyssa's hair. She did not offer a comforting hand. Diane slowly pulled the fabric of her blouse out of her daughter's desperate grip. She took one deliberate step back. Her posture was completely rigid. Her eyes were devoid of any maternal warmth. They were hard and cold. Alyssa Diane said, her voice echoing with a chilling, factual precision. "You were not manipulated. You made a choice. You sat at our dining room table, you ate the food I cooked, and you looked me right in the eye while you tried to steal the roof over my head. You were willing to leave your father and me completely destitute to pay for your mistakes." Alyssa let out a wailing cry, wrapping her arms around herself. She begged her mother to remember that they were family. She pleaded for a second chance. Diane shook her head slowly. Her voice did not rise, but it carried a finality that struck harder than any scream. "A family is built on respect," Diane told her. "A family is built on protection and loyalty. It is not built on extortion. You traded our love for a payout. You chose a thief over your own parents. You are no longer our daughter. You are just a consequence of your own greed. And you are going to have to live with that consequence for the rest of your life." Alyssa collapsed forward, burying her face in her hands. She wept openly, her sobs echoing miserably in the hollow room. She realized no one was coming to save her. There was no secret bank account left to raid. There was no soft landing. There was only the cold, harsh reality of the legal destruction she had brought upon herself. I buttoned my jacket and smoothed the lapels. I reached out and took the digital voice recorder from Michael Lawson, placing it safely into my pocket, right next to the signed liability transfer agreement. I looked at the federal detectives holding my son-in-law in handcuffs. I gave them a short, respectful nod. They nodded back, acknowledging that the operation was complete. I turned to Diane and offered her my arm. She took it, her grip firm and steady. We did not look down at Alyssa weeping on the floor. We did not offer any final words of comfort or rage. We simply turned our backs on the wreckage of their lives. We walked out of the rented office suite and stepped into the quiet carpeted hallway. We walked toward the elevator in total silence. Behind us, we could hear the muffled sounds of the detectives reading Craig the remainder of his charges. We could hear the agonizing, pathetic sound of Alyssa sobbing alone in the lobby of her ruined empire. I pressed the button for the elevator. The doors slid open to reveal our path forward. We stepped inside, turning around, just as the metal doors slid shut, sealing the toxic remains of our past behind us forever. The weeks that followed moved with the brutal and efficient machinery of the federal justice system. The legal hammer fell with a weight and finality that completely obliterated the false empire my daughter and her husband had built. I watched the proceedings from a distance, reading the updates sent by Michael Lawson while I sat peacefully on my back porch. Craig did not get to wear his tailored suits anymore. At his arraignment hearing, the judge reviewed the mountain of evidence Michael and the financial fraud detectives had compiled. Between the offshore money laundering, the extortion attempts, and the signed liability transfer agreement, securing his intent to defraud a senior citizen, the federal prosecutor did not offer a shred of leniency. Because of his ties to underground lenders and his desperate need for cash, the judge deemed Craig an extreme flight risk. Bail was completely denied. The man who had sat in my dining room bragging about international acquisitions was remanded to a federal detention center, staring down the barrel of a decade behind bars. With Craig locked away in a concrete cell, the illusion of their wealthy lifestyle rapidly disintegrated. Alyssa was caught entirely in the blast radius of her husband's collapse. The federal authorities swept through their lives like a hurricane. Because she had willingly co-signed the fraudulent commercial loans using her maiden name, the investigators froze every single bank account associated with her identity. The luxury leased vehicles they drove to my house were repossessed in the middle of the night. The high-end apartment they rented was seized, and Alyssa was formally evicted, with nothing but the clothes she could pack into a few cardboard boxes. Faced with impending accessory to fraud charges, Alyssa was cornered. To avoid sharing a federal prison sentence with her husband, she was forced to cooperate with the authorities and declare absolute bankruptcy. Every asset, every designer handbag, and every piece of jewelry purchased with stolen or borrowed money was liquidated by the state to pay restitution to the lenders they had defrauded. The lavish, entitled life my daughter had paraded around for years evaporated into thin air. She was left entirely destitute, stripped of the wealth she had valued above her own family. It was during these grueling depositions and bankruptcy hearings that the absolute reality of their destruction finally dawned on them. Sitting in the sterile, windowless rooms of a public defender's office, Alyssa had to listen as the prosecutors laid out the timeline of their downfall. She was forced to review the transcripts of the audio recordings I had captured under my dining room table. She had to read the legal clauses of the liability assumption contract Craig had blindly signed in his rented office. The realization crushed whatever remained of her pride. They finally understood that they had not simply run into bad luck. They had not been caught by a random audit or a careless mistake. They realized that their total catastrophic ruin had been meticulously orchestrated by the very man they had completely underestimated. The father they thought was a frail, confused old man had anticipated their every move, built a flawless legal snare, and patiently waited for them to step inside. They thought they were the predators hunting an easy mark, but they had been outmaneuvered by a logistics manager who knew exactly how to isolate and neutralize a toxic threat. Alyssa was left with nothing but the horrifying clarity of her own actions. She had traded the unconditional love and protection of her parents for a share in a criminal enterprise, and in the end, she lost both. The telephone began to ring on a quiet Tuesday afternoon. The autumn leaves were falling gently outside the living room window, settling onto the manicured lawn. I was sitting in my favorite leather armchair, with a cup of black coffee resting on the side table. The caller identification on the digital screen blinked with a number I had not saved, but knew entirely by heart. It was a local area code, likely a prepaid mobile phone, since the federal investigators had confiscated all of Alyssa and Craig's devices during their asset seizure. I did not reach for the receiver. I did not tense up. I simply leaned back into the worn leather and watched the green light flash until it finally stopped and rolled over to the answering machine. It did not stop with one call. The phone rang again an hour later. Then it rang twice more in the evening. By the end of the week, my voicemail inbox was filled to capacity with the frantic, desperate sounds of a woman who had completely run out of options. I listened to every single one of them. I sat in the dim light of my home office, the very same room where I had uncovered her insidious microprint betrayal with a magnifying glass, and I let her voice fill the quiet space. The messages followed a very predictable psychological pattern. At first, she tried to sound indignant and entitled. She left voicemails demanding that I pick up the phone, telling me that I had made my point and that the punishment had gone far enough. She tried to frame herself as the primary victim of a massive misunderstanding, asking how a father could sit by and watch his own flesh and blood bounce between cheap motels and the couches of reluctant friends. She invoked my name, and she invoked her mother, hoping to trigger some deep-seated parental guilt that she could exploit to get a foot back in the door. When the arrogant indignation did not draw me out, her tone rapidly deteriorated into sheer, unadulterated panic. The later messages were stained with heavy, ragged sobbing. She begged me for a place to stay. She promised she would sleep in the basement and earn her keep by doing chores around the house. She swore she was filing for divorce from Craig and that she was finally completely free of his criminal influence. She whispered into the phone receiver that she was still my little girl, the same daughter who used to help me plant tomatoes in the backyard when she was 7 years old. She weaponized every nostalgic memory she could think of, digging frantically through our shared past to find any remaining shred of emotional leverage. I listened to her crying. I listened to her hyperventilating as the terrifying reality of absolute poverty truly set in for her. I knew she was waiting by her phone expecting the old George Bennett to break down and call her back. A younger version of myself might have picked up the phone out of blind instinct. A softer man might have driven across town to whatever miserable location she was calling from and brought her home believing that family loyalty required endless sacrifice. But the man sitting in that home office had spent 40 years managing complex logistics. I knew better than anyone that bringing a toxic, corrupted element back into a secure and thriving system was a fatal, catastrophic error. Diane walked into the office while one of the voicemails was playing. She stood by the doorway, listening to the sound of our daughter begging for sanctuary. Diane did not shed a tear. She did not ask me to pick up the phone. She simply walked over, placed a warm hand on my shoulder, and squeezed gently before walking back out. That silent gesture reinforced everything I already knew. We were entirely united in our resolve. I did not feel a rush of victorious adrenaline as I listened to her suffering. I did not feel any sudden urge to call her back and scream at her or gloat over her spectacular downfall. Anger requires an emotional investment, and I had simply stopped investing. The woman crying on the other end of the telephone line was not the little girl from the tomato garden. That innocent little girl was long gone. The voice echoing from the answering machine belonged to a dangerous stranger who had actively plotted to steal the roof over my head and leave my wife destitute. As the final voicemail reached its end, and her desperate, pathetic pleas faded into a muffled click, I reached out and rested my finger on the answering machine. I pressed the delete button. The automated voice confirmed the erasure, and a profound, heavy silence washed over the room. I pressed delete on the next message and then the next, until the digital inbox was entirely empty. I did not block her phone number. Blocking her would mean I was still hiding from her, or that I feared what she might say. I just let the future calls ring through to the void. The ultimate punishment for a narcissist is not anger or revenge or a dramatic confrontation. The ultimate punishment is absolute irrelevance. By pressing that delete button without offering a single word of response, I administered the final absolute consequence of her actions. She was no longer a factor in our lives. The severance was complete, and it was entirely permanent. The evening air was crisp and carried the sharp, clean scent of fallen autumn leaves. I sat on the back porch of our home beside Diane, watching the sun slowly dip below the tree line. The sky was painted in deep shades of burnt orange and bruised purple, casting long, peaceful shadows across the manicured lawn. I held a ceramic mug of dark roast coffee, letting the warmth seep into my palms. The neighborhood was entirely quiet. There were no ringing telephones, no desperate knocking at the door, and no looming threats waiting in the shadows. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, the heavy, suffocating weight of anticipation was completely gone. Our sanctuary was finally ours again. I looked out at the far corner of the yard, where a wooden swing set used to stand 30 years ago. I allowed myself to feel the grief of losing my daughter. It was not a sharp, violent pain anymore. It was a dull, hollow ache. Diane and I did not pretend that the last few weeks were a joyful victory. We were mourning the death of the bright, innocent little girl we had raised. We grieved for the daughter who used to run across that very grass, laughing and chasing fireflies in the twilight. But we also acknowledged the absolute necessity of separating that memory from the woman she had become. The woman who had conspired to leave us homeless was a stranger. Diane reached out and rested her hand over mine. Her touch was gentle, but grounded with an unshakable strength. She looked out at the fading light and spoke softly, breaking the silence. She told me that sometimes a part of your own body turns against you. She compared the betrayal to a malignant sickness. You do not negotiate with a disease. You do not welcome a tumor and hope it learns to treat you kindly. You cut it out completely so the rest of the body can survive. It is a brutal, agonizing process, but it is the only way to stay alive. We had excised the toxicity from our lives, and we were finally healing. I squeezed her hand, agreeing with every word. As the twilight deepened, my thoughts drifted back to the very beginning of the nightmare. I thought about that crisp morning standing by the mailbox, holding the thick envelope that contained her deceptive letter and the hidden legal trap. I reflected deeply on the sheer power of silence. My initial instinct had been a burning, overwhelming desire to confront her. I had wanted to pick up the phone and scream at her, demanding to know how she could betray her own family so ruthlessly. But if I had let my emotions dictate my actions, I would have lost everything. If I had reacted with explosive anger, I would have shown them my hand. They would have known I found the microprint, and they would have simply regrouped and found a new devious way to attack us. By swallowing my rage and refusing to react emotionally, I had protected my wife. I had protected my lifetime of hard work. I had protected my dignity. Silence had been my absolute greatest weapon. It allowed my enemies to grow arrogant. It allowed them to walk blindly into a cage of their own making, believing they were the smartest people in the room right up until the federal handcuffs locked around their wrists. The cool breeze picked up, rustling the dry leaves across the patio. I took a slow, deep breath, filling my lungs with the clean evening air. I realized in that quiet moment the true definition of wealth. For 40 years, I had managed logistics contracts and built a financial empire thinking that money was the ultimate goal. Craig and Alyssa certainly believed that money was the only thing that mattered, willing to trade their freedom and their family for a payout. But they were entirely wrong. Real wealth is not the balance sitting in an offshore holding company. It is not the designer suits, the luxury cars, or the expansive real estate portfolios. Real wealth is autonomy. It is the absolute, unshakable security of a peaceful life. It is the ability to sit on your back porch with the woman you have loved for 4 decades, knowing that nobody can touch you. It is the profound quiet of a home that is no longer compromised by deceit. We had money, yes, but our true victory was the impenetrable peace we had secured for our twilight years. The sun finally slipped below the horizon, leaving the yard bathed in the soft glow of the moon. The coffee in my mug had gone cold. Diane stood up, pulling her knitted cardigan a little tighter around her shoulders. She smiled down at me, a serene and beautiful smile that wiped away the remaining shadows of the past weeks. She told me it was getting chilly, and it was time to go inside. I stood up and followed my wife back into the warmth of our home. I stepped across the threshold and pulled the heavy wooden front door shut behind us. I reached out and turned the brass deadbolt. The loud, solid click of the lock echoed in the quiet foyer. It was the sound of absolute finality. The storm was over, the predators were gone, and the fortress was secure. I turned off the porch light, plunging the outside world into darkness, and walked into the bright, peaceful sanctuary of my living room, ready to simply live. The most profound takeaway from George's journey is that true power often lies in silence and emotional restraint. When faced with deep betrayal from those closest to us, our instinct is usually to react with immediate, explosive anger. However, George demonstrates that stepping back, analyzing the threat objectively, and removing emotion from the equation is the ultimate form of self-preservation. Furthermore, the narrative reminds us that family is defined by mutual respect and loyalty, not just shared blood. Sometimes the bravest and most necessary thing you can do is sever toxic ties to protect your own peace and dignity. If George's story resonated with you, or you have ever had to set difficult boundaries to protect your peace, please share your experience in the comments below and hit subscribe for more empowering stories of resilience and justice.